It has been called the most unpopular war in America since Vietnam.
They died in a just cause for defending freedom, and they will not have died in vain.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Iraq War. While the war in Iraq officially began in March 2003, it was decades in the making. After the Gulf War ended in 1991, the United Nations imposed sanctions that prevented Iraq from building or housing weapons of mass destruction. The United States and its allies also pressured Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein as leader. Despite these limitations, Iraq was accused of having access to a number of destructive items, including biological weapons, poison gas, and more. Following 9/11, President George W. Bush and his administration attempted disarmament efforts with renewed gusto.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Meanwhile, Iraq did not fully cooperate with UN weapons inspections. By 2002, Bush warned that Iraq would face military action should they not allow these security checks. In October 2002, the joint resolution to authorize the use of United States armed forces against Iraq was approved by the U.S. Senate, allowing Bush to legally invade Iraq as part of his war on terror.
When I say we will lead a coalition of the willing to disarm him if he chooses not to disarm, I mean it.
The U.S. also claimed an interest in installing a democratic regime in Iraq. However, fellow NATO members France, Germany, and Canada, in addition to Russia, were all against an invasion of Iraq, and instead wanted to disarm the country through diplomatic negotiations. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Tony Blair's United Kingdom pushed ahead with their plans. On March 20, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began. Almost 250,000 American soldiers fought beside 45,000 British soldiers and more troops from a variety of other nations. With this invasion, the US and UK hoped to end the Hussein regime, eliminate WMDs, remove radical Islamists, and give humanitarian aid wherever possible. They also hoped to take control of Iraqi oil and to install a model democratic government. On April 9th, the US-led coalition took the city of Baghdad, and this signaled the end of Saddam Hussein's reign. A transitional government was then put into place. The Coalition Provisional Authority stayed in office until mid-2004 and held power over the government of Iraq. By May 2003, Bush considered the war a mission accomplished and declared victory despite the fact Saddam Hussein had not yet been captured.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Insurgent and guerrilla attacks increased following that speech and caused a number of U.S. military deaths. Efforts were then increased to catch former government leaders. Saddam Hussein's sons were killed, and many important people were captured. Saddam himself was finally taken at the end of 2003, and this signaled an improvement in conditions as insurgent attacks briefly decreased. Unfortunately, by the spring of 2004, not only did insurgency resume, it also intensified.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq.
Violent battles, like the first and second battles of Fallujah, resulted in civilian, police, and U.S. military deaths. Meanwhile, support at home and abroad waned, as it was revealed that the U.S. military was abusing prisoners at Abu Ghraib. In fact, this turned out to be a defining moment of the war. Fighting, insurgency, IEDs, and suicide bombings continued over the next years. After a general election at the end of 2005, Iraq's permanent government took control in May 2006. Shortly thereafter, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq was located and killed. At the end of 2006, amid reports that suggested the situation in Iraq was not progressing, Saddam Hussein's death sentence was carried out after he was found guilty of crimes against humanity. By 2007, the U.S. began employing a surge strategy and deployed more troops. Meanwhile, allies began withdrawing their forces. The next year, things stabilized and fatalities dropped significantly. 2008 also saw the approval of the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement. Most importantly, this deal meant American troops would be removed from Iraq by the end of 2011. An exit strategy was presented in 2009, and in October 2011, President Barack Obama pledged the American presence would end as promised.
As of January 1st, and in keeping with our strategic framework agreement with Iraq, it will be a normal relationship between sovereign nations, an equal partnership based on mutual interests and mutual respect.
Meanwhile, the restrictions placed on Iraq in the 1990s were lifted by the UN, and this gave the Iraqi government control of the country's oil. Since it began, the Iraq War cost American taxpayers trillions of dollars and took countless soldier and civilian lives. It ultimately became one of the longest and most divisive battles in U.S. history.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases, to help with intelligence and logistics, to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
said that's when they bought into the whole argument that we should go to war.
When Iraq finally admitted having these weapons in 1995, the quantities were vast. Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
By and large, the entire American news media swallowed that fish. They were like seals in a zoo, and Powell was dropping fish in their mouth, and they almost without exception, and I made a list, I don't have it in front of me, but a list of all of the leading newspapers, all of the leading news networks didn't question that presentation.
At the beginning of 2003, George Bush enjoyed overwhelming domestic support, but he also knew he had a problem. His administration was preparing to invade Iraq, but of the 192 countries then recognized by the UN, he could only find 4 others willing to take part.
If war is forced upon us, we will fight in a just cause and by just means, sparing in every way we can the innocent.
Intense diplomatic and economic pressure from the White House wasn't working, and while other nations said they were willing to send forces after the initial invasion, only the United Kingdom, Australia, Denmark and Poland were willing to commit troops from the start. The rest of the world seemed determined to let weapons inspections continue, a policy the White House had grown weary of.
Cheney was highly critical of inspections, and I think on one occasion he said that inspectors are useless at best. And he wanted the US to go ahead with an invasion and not having the complication. He saw that inspections could be complications. Suppose these guys come up and say there is nothing. That would be a complication for the United States.
So the diplomatic compromise concocted by the White House was the coalition of the willing. And on the surface it sounded impressive. However, certain discrepancies were quickly noted. For example, the European nations included on the list were there because their main contribution to the coalition was simply to let British and American aircraft fly over them. But that was a far greater contribution than most of the rest of the countries, particularly those in Central and South America who couldn't even provide airspace. They were included simply because they'd spoken out against Saddam, which explains the presence in this coalition of devastated war-torn countries like Afghanistan and Eritrea, which obviously had very little to contribute. So why announce this coalition and not just wait until UN Resolution 1441, which called for further inspections, resolved the WMD question once and for all?
We had a mandate from the Security Council. We didn't have a mandate from the United States or from the UK. It was the whole Security Council. We were international civil servants. We were asked to verify with professionalism whether there were any weapons of mass destruction.
So given the scrutiny the list was generating even as the war began, why did the White House announce it at all? The answer, say critics, lies in mathematics. Not only were no Arab countries participating, but of those that were, Australia, Denmark and Poland, they combined to only send 2,500 troops. The British and Americans, by contrast, were sending in 165,000. Therefore, the contributions of the other nations taking part added up to less than 2% of the invasion force. And here, near the CENTCOM headquarters, where the war was mapped and carried out, those numbers weren't helpful. And that led to the heart of George Bush's problem. Unless his administration could think of an alternative, this war could be seen as an Anglo-American invasion of an oil-rich Arab state, especially if things went wrong and an invasion turned into an occupation. And so the coalition of the willing was born. Owen Fay, Al Jazeera, Doha.
without the right to vote in accordance with the...
I am departing somewhat proud of what this mission has achieved in a short period of time, and by our own joint success with the Iraqis in overcoming what sometimes have appeared to be difficult challenges. We have together helped to turn the page on how the Iraqis is viewing the United Nations, the organization, the international community, and we have together contributed to Iraq assuming a new standing among the world community as an increasingly stable and sovereign nation.
So decided. I invite the representative of...
If the Iraqis can avoid, and they are, diffuse tensions, if they are capable of seeing changes in their daily lives through sustainable security gains, which are taking place, deliver basic services and more political inclusiveness, and we see movement in that direction, all of this being realistic goals, then Iraq will be flourishing.
The Iraqi people, driven by a belief in their mission to build a free and democratic Iraq, are building a democracy through mechanisms based on ballot boxes and not on bullet boxes.
Provisions of the Charter and Rule 37 of the Constitution.
The United States remains deeply committed to Iraq. As this Council knows, the United States plans, in accordance with the U.S.-Iraq Security Agreement, to withdraw its combat troops from Iraq's cities, towns, and villages no later than the end of this month. That, in turn, will pave the way for the withdrawal of all U.S. forces by the end of 2011. Our drawdown and withdrawal, however, in no way diminish our long-term partnership with Iraq.
Thank you very much. You are quite right.
I'll read the letter, Chief Justice. It's here in Arabic. Yes. As recognized in the UN Security Council Resolution 1546, the Coalition Provisional Authority will cease to exist on June 28th, at which point the occupation will end and the Iraqi interim government will assume and exercise full sovereign authority on behalf of the Iraqi people. We welcome Iraq's steps to take its rightful place of equality and honor among the free nations of the world. Sincerely, L. Paul Bremer, ex-administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority.
This is a historical day for transfer of sovereignty to the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people. We have been working very hard with Ambassador Bremer and with the coalition and Ambassador Richmond to achieve the transfer of sovereignty as quickly as possible. We have done this today, and we feel that we are capable and in control of the situation and of the security situation.
The future of Iraq belongs to you, the Iraqi people. We and your other friends will help, but we can only help. You must do the real work. The Iraq your children and their children inherit will depend on your actions in the months and years ahead. You Iraqis must now take responsibility for your future of hope.
Dozens of people are dead after a string of attacks across Iraq. The blasts, many involving car bombs, erupted less than a week before Iraqis in much of the country are scheduled to vote. It's the first election since the 2011 U.S. troop withdrawal. At least 36 people were killed and more than 200 others wounded in the attacks. There were blasts in several parts of the country, including Baghdad, Fallujah, and in this town south of Kirkuk. Here, 3 parked car bombs exploded, and 2 bombs targeted the house of a Shiite candidate for the upcoming provincial election. Iraqis vote Saturday for local-level officials. It's a test of the strength of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's political bloc, as well as the ability of security forces to keep the country safe. The blasts all happened around the same time Monday morning. Authorities believe insurgents are growing stronger and increasingly coordinating with allies, fighting to topple Syrian President Bashar Assad across the border. Nicole Grether, The Associated Press.
Decision, and this is a fight America can and must win.
Bush's approval rating is at 31%, a 40-point drop since the eve of the Iraq invasion. In Iraq, Baghdad resident Abu Abdullah dismissed Bush's self-praise.
Whatever Bush says, he does not care about the interests of the Iraqi people or the interest of the Arab and Islamic world. He only cares about the interest of America. They are only looking for oil wells and bases for them in the world. If you ask me about what Bush wants, I will say that he wants to destroy Iraq and the Arab and Islamic world.
A recent survey found more than 2/3 of Iraqis believe U.S.-led coalition forces should leave Iraq. A quarter of those surveyed said they'd lost a family member to murder since the war began. Meanwhile, a new CNN poll shows 2/3 of Americans oppose the war, while more than 7 out of 10 believe it's hurt the economy. In an interview with ABC's Good Morning America, Vice President Dick Cheney said public opinion is of little concern.
On the security front, I think there's a general consensus that we've made major progress, that the surge has worked. That's been a major success.
2/3 of Americans say it's not worth fighting.
So?
So you don't care what the American people think?
No, I think you cannot be blown off course by the fluctuations in the public opinion polls.
Cheney spent the war's 5th anniversary in Oman, where he went fishing on the Sultan of Oman's 60-foot royal yacht. Cheney is now in Afghanistan as he continues a Middle East tour.
Iraqis are no stranger to violence, but the recent wave of attacks have created an atmosphere of uncertainty in this country. More than 1,000 people were killed in July, the worst month in years. Most attacks are carried out by Al-Qaeda, a Sunni extremist organization. Their main targets are Shiite neighborhoods like this one in Baghdad.
This is all Al-Qaeda's work. They are trying to create divisions between people. We have to manage our reactions. We should not give them what they want. It could also be the politicians. They might be linked to these acts of violence for their own interests.
The deterioration in security has brought back bitter memories of the past. In 2006 and 2007, many Sunni areas became no-go zone for Shias and vice versa. Situation has improved though. Plenty of neighborhoods like this one are mixed again. When you talk to people here, you have a sense that they want to live together, but fear is looming. After the withdrawal of the last U.S. troops in 2011, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki cracked down on senior Sunni politicians, accusing them of terrorism. For months, Sunnis staged protests in areas like this, the Baghdadi district of Adamiyah, calling for an end to what they see as discrimination against them.
We did not rise against the Shiites. We rose against the government that is denying our rights. The government must stop violating our human rights. Our men are in prison and our areas suffer. We won't accept that. We either live in dignity or we die in dignity.
This bridge linking Sunni and Shiite communities was 8 years ago a scene of devastation. More than 1,000 Shiite pilgrims were killed in a stampede. It remained closed for years, and tensions eased, but when it reopened, so did old wounds. Today, the atmosphere of mistrust is back, but there is a feeling that if the communities on either side of the divide can work out their differences, the future for this city and this country may be more stable. Rafid Jabouri, BBC News, Baghdad.
Yes. Well, first of all, it's a very old theory because no government in any high civilization and in many low civilizations, no government will send young men into battle to kill and be killed without offering some justification for what they are doing. And so just war theory is simply an argument about what justifications make sense. What are the plausible justifications? And how do we, as citizens, judge what governments do when they go to war? And the Greeks had arguments about when to fight and how to fight, and there are biblical accounts of arguments about when to fight and how to fight, and in the Islamic tradition there are arguments. And just war theory as a doctrine, it comes out of Catholic moral theology in the Middle Ages. So this is an ongoing and a very long ongoing argument. And among us, the argument has a double character. There are arguments about when to go to war. When is it just to fight? This is called jus ad bellum, the justice of war. And we hang on issues of aggression. It's right to resist an attack. Just as you could resist on a city street if you were mugged, you could fight back, and that would be a miniature version of a just war. And it's also just to come to the aid of the victim of aggression, as you might do on a city street if you were brave enough. And that would be a just war. And we've also begun to think that when there is a massacre going on inside a state, when a government is massacring some minority, or maybe even not a minority, a majority of its citizens, the way the Cambodian Khmer Rouge regime did, that it is just to go in and stop it by force if necessary. So those are the just occasions of war. And then there is justice in war, jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war, and that hangs mostly on issues of non-combatant immunity, of discrimination, of attacking only other soldiers. So it hangs on a very old idea that war is a combat between combatants from which non-combatants should be shielded. Non-combatants means women and children, old men, it means medical personnel, it means religious officials. It has even meant, in some circumstances, the merchants who sell weapons to both sides were, in some accounts, treated as non-combatants whom nobody should attack. But basically, for us, it means the civilian population should not be subject to attack in war. One challenge which I've written about is to add to jus ad bellum, the justice of war, and jus in bello, justice in war, a jus post bellum, justice after war. Once you have defeated the other side, what are your obligations in this, what might be a devastated country? It might be a country, if you've overthrown a regime like the Nazi regime in Germany, and you've occupied the country, what constitutes just behavior then? And that's an issue obviously raised, well, we thought it was raised in Iraq, except we never reached the post-bellum. We started to talk as if it was after the war, but it wasn't and isn't. So in Iraq, we're still confronted with in bello arguments about the conduct of war. But that's an important question, and you can see it in the way in something like the NATO protectorate in Kosovo, we fought a mini war with the Serbs, and Kosovo was then put under a kind of NATO protectorate with UN authorization. And then what should NATO do? We have soldiers in Kosovo. What should they be doing? What constitutes a just conduct when you're occupying somebody else's country?
I was away for the weekend and my mother rang and said something awful has happened. There's been some form of explosion and we can't get hold of your brother, but he'll be fine, don't worry. And I said, well, have you tried to ring him? And she said, yes, but his phone is off. And I remember very clearly saying to her, you need to know that he's dead. I instinctively knew that he was killed.
On October 12th, 2002, blasts ripped through 2 nightclubs in Bali, Indonesia, killing 202, including 28 Britons, and injuring scores more. Sportsman Peter Record was among the victims.
Knowing Pete, he would have phoned us immediately. You know, he wouldn't have let us wait. And then we got the news from friends of his, you know, that he had indeed been killed.
The Bali bombs were a watershed for the country, which has the world's largest Muslim population, forcing the secular state to confront the presence of violent extremists. In the years following the attacks, over 600 suspected militants were arrested and many convicted and jailed. 3 al-Qaeda-aligned men convicted of being the ringleaders of the attacks were executed in 2008, whilst the suspected mastermind, Ridwan Izamuddin or Hambali, is detained in Guantanamo Bay. Finally, 10 years on and around the world, tributes and memorials have been held to mark the anniversary of the attacks. In Australia, where 88 people were killed, a sombre service in Parliament House remembered those who died, led by Governor-General Quentin Bryce.
How proud we can be of all those who played their part. It was a time that changed them, indeed, all of us.
Meanwhile, in Bali itself, senior members of all major Indonesian religions gathered to remember the dead and as a show of solidarity against the extremists who've targeted their country in the past.
This remembrance is a valuable opportunity to renew, to reiterate our collective commitment to strengthen the voice of moderation, of tolerance, of mutual understanding among different communities.
Nordin Top was JI's self-appointed military commander, an enigmatic leader who had a gift for turning angry young men into martyrs.
JI, quite cunningly and some might say cowardly, tried to draw young men who were interested in the more radical ideas of Islam into small groups, using charismatic individuals like Nordin Top.
The investigation became a manhunt, a deadly game of cat and mouse, as the 2 terrorist masterminds moved between various safe houses within the Jemaah Islamiyah network.
They basically spread themselves out across Indonesia, and as you know, Indonesia is a huge archipelago, thousands of islands, 240 million people. It's an easy place to hide.
Nordin Top and Dr. Azahari had both trained for holy war in al-Qaeda military camps. They were hardline Islamists committed to the wholesale slaughter of Westerners. In this chilling call to arms, Nordin Top urges his JI followers to include Australians as prime targets.
Adalah aliansi Salibi, Amerika, Australia, Inggris, Italia, dan kami nyatakan juga bahwa
We knew as soon as they could draw breath, as soon as they could stop being pursued, that they would be assembling more bombs and assembling more plots to launch attacks around Indonesia.
And the AFP's worst fears were realised on August the 5th, 2003. Nordin Top and Dr. Azahari, the masterminds of the Bali atrocity, struck again.
Indonesia's anti-terrorist squad has arrested 11 suspected Islamic militants it said planned to attack the US Embassy, a plaza near Australia's embassy and the offices of Freeport McMoran Copper and Gold. The Detachment 88 squad seized bomb-making equipment and one bomb ready to be used by a new militant group called Araka Sunni for the Indonesian Society, a national police spokesman reported in a statement. Reported targets include the US consulate in Surabaya, East Java, the embassy in Jakarta and Plaza 89 in Jakarta, in front of the Australian embassy and offices of mining company Freeport. Hasmi also allegedly planned an attack on the mobile police brigade in the central Java city of Serondol. The arrests by the elite police squad in the island of Java were the latest step in a crackdown by authorities against militants, during which dozens have been arrested and at least 7 killed. They come 10 years this month after a bomb attack in Bali killed 202 people, most of whom were foreign tourists. Since Special Detachment 88 was formed in 2003, the Indonesian security forces have arrested more than 700 suspected militants and killed about 60.
Menerima dukungan dari Kemitraan Pendidikan Indonesia Austria. Please welcome Minister Carr.
It's a great honour for me to be here today. I've been to many schools in Australia, one other school in Indonesia, and if there's one thing I like to hear, it's the sound of the voices of those primary school boys and girls as you arrive in a school playground.
Indonesian police say they'll summon members of the country's elite counter-terrorism force for questioning of allegations of torture. The summons comes after video emerged online appearing to show suspected terrorists being tortured and shot by officers, allegedly from the Detachment 88 unit. Indonesia's Human Rights Commission says it's investigating about 20 cases of human rights violations, and they've been joined by several Muslim leaders in condemning the incident. Indonesia correspondent George Roberts reports, and a warning: the story contains graphic images.
The Indonesian police chief says 16 officers have been arrested and referred for possible criminal charges over a video showing police mistreating terrorist suspects. The footage was sent to Islamic clerics who complained about the behaviour of the officers but also denounced terrorism. The Police Commissioner General Sutarman says the footage was a compilation of 2 separate incidents, one in 2007 and another last year. He says officers from last year's incident breached police protocol and may face criminal charges. The Human Rights Commission's Sita Nualela says it's also investigating about 20 other allegations of violations by Indonesian police. George Roberts, ABC News, Jakarta.